My guest this week is Jacob Robinson, host of the Law of Code podcast, where he talks to the top legal leaders in Web3. Additionally, Jacob is an associate attorney at McCarthy Tétrault, one of the most prominent law firms in Canada, where he helps clients like crypto exchanges navigate the complex regulatory landscape in Canada. In these two roles, Jacob hopes to be a leader in stewarding policy forward and helping to legitimize the industry by enabling more effective formations of capital and business structures. If you want an update on how to build a sustainable business in Web3, this is a great episode. One additional disclaimer: the opinions expressed by Jacob Robinson in this episode are solely his own and do not constitute legal advice nor the opinion of McCarthy Tétrault. LFG baby, let's start vibing.
Zach French is a bar-certified attorney, and nothing expressed by Zach during Web3 with me shall be considered legal advice. All the opinions expressed by Zach and his guests are solely their own opinions. All content in Web3 with me is for informational purposes only. Zach and his podcast guests may maintain positions in the securities discussed during Web3 with me.
Welcome to the show, Jacob.
Thank you, Zach. It's a pleasure to be here.
You know, early on in my Web3 podcast journey, I came across your show, The Law of Code, and enjoyed quite a few episodes. I know that you and I have had a few conversations, so I'm looking forward to digging deep into to Web3 with you.
Yeah, me as well. It's been a fun journey since I started the podcast almost 2 years ago now, and I've had a chance to interview over 100 of the top lawyers, regulators, and entrepreneurs in the space to learn about the legal side of Web3. And I think it's amazing to me how much of a foundation regulation sets for builders and entrepreneurs across the world. So it's something, especially in light of all the regulation by enforcement that we've been seeing. I think these are important conversations to have. So really looking forward to diving into that with you.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome. And always, I would say it's timely, but I feel like it's always timely lately, because we never know what's going to happen, especially after Gensler's testimony last week. So anyways, I usually start these podcasts letting my audience get to know who you are, even outside of this space. You know, what makes Jacob Jacob? So feel free to start wherever you'd like.
That's a big question. Usually I don't venture outside of the crypto space with with my questions. But for me, I mean, I grew up, I'm Canadian. I grew up just outside Toronto. I live in Toronto now. I'm a securities regulatory lawyer at McCarthy Tétrault, one of the largest firms in Canada, and I primarily help crypto asset exchanges and participants in the space navigate the regulatory landscape in Canada. In my spare time, I still in the crypto space run the podcast called Law of Code that I mentioned before. I'm also very interested in sports. That's been a big part of my life. I love playing basketball, football, soccer, volleyball, almost anything that there was some form of competitive aspect to it. Now it's a bit more of golf and spike ball and leisurely sports that you can play on weekends without too much commitment. But that's always been a big part of my life. I enjoy fantasy football, spending time with friends, playing board games, going out to concerts and things like that, and traveling as well. I like to make sure that I'm getting in one or two travel, I call them adventures, where you go mountain biking or hiking or climbing, things like that every year. So I like to think, I think the problem that I have sometimes is I enjoy life a bit too much. There are so many things in life that I find interesting and fun to do and explore, and crypto is no different in that my curiosity has kept me really going down the rabbit hole in this space. But in terms of what makes me me, I think those are a few things that I would highlight.
Yeah, it seems like you obviously have a competitive aspect to what you're doing, but also you enjoy a good adrenaline junkie activity, just to like keep things interesting. What did it take for you to want to be a lawyer? I mean, law school, I'm a lawyer too. It's a big commitment. It's not an easy job out there. There's a lot of burnout in the legal community. What was it about you that attracted legal?
I think for me, it was the problem-solving nature of it. I always enjoyed problem-solving. When I was younger, that would mean helping my mom with the remote and figuring out how to turn the volume down on the TV or go back to the channel that she was on before I changed it. But then as I got older, it became advising businesses and helping friends with situations they were in. And my favorite part, I studied business in undergrad, and I went to school in Germany for about 2 years to get a degree there. And we would do these case competitions, and you would sit down, you would have either a couple days or a couple hours to think of a solution to the problem that was presented in the case. And I always enjoyed that aspect of my education the most. And I thought, how can I do this full time? And law seemed to be a way to do that. You're constantly presented with novel, interesting problems for very important situations. The difference is there's a little bit more pressure when they're real life situations rather than just a case competition that you might not win. So it has been an interesting journey. And I think what makes it more sustainable for me is that I'm working in a field I'm interested in with clients who I truly want to see succeed. Not that other lawyers don't, but I think when you're in the crypto space and you see the promise of this new technology, it does give you a little bit extra push compared to someone in an established industry like real estate or mining, where the rules have been in place for so long, that players have been in place for so long. It's much more of an established culture, whereas I find the crypto side of law is very interesting. It's constantly evolving, and there aren't too many people who stay on top of it. So I do feel a bit of a, not pressure, but an ongoing obligation to continue learning in the space, and it makes it enjoyable for me.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I mean, oftentimes on the show, it comes up of like NFT time or crypto time or Web3 time, how things are just moving so fast. I've never thought about it as an aspect to keep a legal job interesting, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you've got to constantly be reading that. What kind of, I guess, either habits or practices or solutions do you use to make sure that you're on top of that?
I think the biggest one that I've done is aim to be consistent. Like once you build that habit of, okay, a big announcement comes out, I'm going to read about it, post a Twitter thread on it, you set the expectation for yourself, and then it becomes less of an obligation and more of just who you are and part of your identity. So for me, it's been, initially it was at least curiosity, and I just wanted to know what these rules are. And now that I'm much busier with a legal profession compared to in law school, it's more of a time commitment and harder to justify given certain time constraints that I'm facing now. So a lot of it is just that interest that has continued, and the automation of the habit has made it a lot easier for me. I think the second point though is it has to come naturally. Like if I wasn't genuinely interested, I wouldn't be able to do it. And if you asked me to come up with Twitter threads on the updates pertaining to the Canadian Income Tax Act, I don't know what I would do. I'd probably have to leave Canada just to avoid that obligation, because it's not as interesting for me. Whereas seeing what's happening with the regulatory landscape in crypto in Canada is really interesting, and I want to keep tabs on how it progresses. So it is less of an obligation and more of just something that I've built into who I am.
One of the things that we explore a lot on this show related to that is the perspective that Web3, crypto, blockchain suffers from, right? The public perception that it's for scammers, it's trading pictures of monkeys back and forth. I try to bring people on the show that are bringing a legitimate eye to this. And I think you're one of those people that embodies that. How do you think about that when you're talking to clients? Are they already coming to you with kind of like trust in crypto, trust in the system, or are you having to add that as an aspect on top of knowing the regulation?
I mean, when it comes to clients in the crypto space, there isn't much convincing to do for them. I find they have a really good understanding of where the opportunities are here. But there are lawyers in the hallways who make jokes. There are friends of mine who send me pictures of the price of Bitcoin when it drops below a certain level, especially many other altcoins that I won't name. But I think a big problem in the industry is that we're so quick to dismiss the monkey trading and the trading of pictures of monkeys and things like that as, well, that's not what it is. To be fair, that is a good part of what crypto has been. And if we just ignore that and pretend it doesn't exist, I don't think we move the narrative forward in the way we want. What I always try to do is read the best, most critical articles that I can find of crypto to find out where my blind spots might be and where I might be over enthusiastic. When I was in law school and I was learning about crypto, I thought, we don't need fiat currencies. Like, this is the future. And I was a bit naive in my takes on what the future could look like. And I think as I've gotten a bit more experienced in the space, it's become clear that just because there are aspects of crypto that might not be beneficial to society, things like wash trading, trading of NFTs that might not have any value to society at large doesn't mean the technology itself isn't useful. Just like in the early stages of the internet, when you had pirating of music, for example, doesn't mean the future can't be streaming and so much better for everybody in the world. And so when I look at crypto, I think that to me, what gets me the most excited is when people say things like, well, how do you feel after this FTX collapse? And how do you justify that given what you say crypto promises? And to me, every example that people give are perfect examples of why crypto is beneficial. And when you look at centralized players who have held control in such small authoritative roles within the business, it's so obvious why a larger decentralized model that can remove that necessary trust and the expense that you pay for that trust in a way that can provide still the same tools and benefits to the end user really gets me excited, and is something I try to focus on when we think about crypto in general and the benefits that it will give to society moving forward.
Yeah, I think a few interesting points. One, you got to find balance, right? There's not all of it is going to be trading NFTs, and some of it's going to be just using the technology to do certain things. But that doesn't mean that digital art is useless, right? The ability to bring out the creative side and certain people that really didn't have other avenues to make a living prior to something like this, and having collectors who truly believe in supporting those artists, right? Like that's still there. That doesn't change because of a crash, right? Are there less people involved? Absolutely. But when I think about that stuff, I think of the same when I think about things like FTX. And I saw a meme the other day. It's like 10 deep. Oh, finally we got rid of that one guy. Oh shoot, there's another guy. Oh shoot, there's another guy. And you're going all the way down. Guess what? Fraud, deceit, grifters, if you will. That's been happening in every industry that is speculative for a very long time. This just happens to be the one where you can amass value very highly, and it's in the spotlight. That doesn't make it okay, but that's just reality. And we need these people to be removed. And the more people that we do get out of the space that are like that, the better chance we have of like building out what it can truly become.
And it gets me, this might sound funny, but it does get me very excited when I see how successful fraudulent actors have been. And if those entities can reach this level of success, imagine people who are really pushing things forward and making a difference in the world can go.
Yeah, the impact side of it is something I focus a lot on in this show. And I talk to probably, I would say 60 to 70% of my guests now are marketers.
Interesting.
And they come into this space. I purposely go for marketers that were not in Web3 and moved to Web3 and had experience outside of Web3. Because what they're doing is they're taking what's useful out of this space, and then they're coming in for a lot of the same reasons people that are native to this space came in, which is like the ability to bring collective groups together around shared values, pool capital, and actually affect some sort of change that are related to those values. And that's powerful. It's really powerful.
That's a perfect way to put it. I think this is the first time we can create a system that removes the need to trust some third party to maintain the ledger of ownership that acts as the economic incentives to drive people's action. And the best predictor of human action is the incentive. If you incentivize someone, like in law firms, to work 2,000 hours a year, they're much more likely to do it than if you only incentivize them to work 1,500. And when you think of something like DAOs and crypto generally, now you can have these incentives in place that don't require something like a cap table to be managed by one person who could arbitrarily trade it or arbitrarily change it in a manner that they feel. It's just, to me, and I think as lawyers, we're able to recognize the importance and the cost that we place on trust. I was talking to a friend earlier about when you have about contracts and thinking of DeFi in the span of contracts. When you have a contract, a lender-borrower agreement, even one with your bank, you're trusting the courts to uphold it. You're trusting the bank to honor their promises. You're trusting the financial system to remain intact. You're trusting the internet to stay. You're trusting so many different actors that all play a role. Meanwhile, when you're in DeFi, the amount of people you have to trust is so much smaller. Therefore, the cost you have to pay for that trust is so much smaller. And I think that itself will provide so much more efficiency and unlock capital to be used in so many better ways. A really good example is even comparing Bitcoin to gold. If you're storing gold bars, think about the costs that are expended to hold gold bars in Fort Knox or something. When you compare it to like a USB stick that's in a safety deposit box with the private key sort of spread out, or the seed phrase spread out across the world, for example, it's night and day difference. And so to me, the efficiencies that we're going to see in the economic activity, I think will really change the world.
Yeah. I think that what you're seeing is kind of like it's a flattening, right? Overall, that things that I think that we had to rely on third parties for, we no longer do. It's putting trust back into the individual, but also the collective, right? Which is just, it's mind bending if you talk to somebody about it that doesn't know anything about this space, right? They're kind of like, well, wait, like, no, I just want to give my money to the bank, which is totally fine. But like, you see what happens with Silicon Valley Bank. Like, it still can happen, right? And what happens if more of that happens, right? Like, it's a check and balance. Call it a balance. Call it like a diversification, if you will, of our reliance on the way we do financial services. Now, it presents its own set of problems, right? The quality of the code, the quality of the people writing the code for these apps, these dApps that are running decentralized finance applications is more important than ever. We see DeFi hacks all the time. Do you deal with any of that in your work that you can kind of talk about, or at least provide like a general opinion around?
In terms of hacks?
In terms of, like decentralized finance and the kind of the struggle to do quality contract auditing and maintain quality developers. Because look, blockchain is relatively new, right? Like, not a lot of people have been doing this for longer than a year or two. So that inexperience kind of plays through when you see a lot of this money being stolen.
I think it is such an under-discussed topic and something that will have a huge impact going forward. It's difficult because it is so new. And even if you have smart contracts audited, for example, those audits could be mistaken. There can be errors, omissions. You can never fully be confident that what you have is unhackable. The DAO is a good example of this. Just like the Titanic was the unsinkable ship, it doesn't, you can never fully mitigate the risks. From a legal side, it's not something we dive into as often because it is so technical, and we can't really opine on the code on the back end. What we can do is set up systems to protect the builders and protect them via contracts. And that's where that law of code comes into play to tie into the code is law ethos, where now you can set up a system to have some form of protection. That being said, it's not something I've typically seen in the DeFi space, where most of the effectuation of a contract or any form of agreement is done on chain. That's where I do think we'll see moving forward the importance of code auditors continue to grow and grow. And I'm sure there'll be software systems that can find exploits. White hat hackers are growing in prominence as well, because it is a difficult dynamic where you want to incentivize people to find these problems, but you also don't want to incentivize them too much where they exploit them or spend all their time trying to hack your protocol. Because if they're hacking for $60 million and you're only offering them 60,000, it gets a lot more tempting for someone to take the whole pie. And we've seen that in many cases, like even Mango Markets with Avi accused to have hacked the protocol. He probably could have just reported that and taken some sort of white hat hacker fee, but he felt justified in that code is law ethos. And I think that's something we're going to continue to see flushed out over the years as more and more people realize that code is not, in fact, law. Law is law, and law was created for a reason.
Yeah, no, it's a really good point. Even if you go back to the original hack of the DAO, right, back in 2017, it's if you're exploiting something in the contract that's built into the contract, are you doing anything illegal, right? If the code is law, right? And so, like, yeah, I'm actually just within the confines of the smart contract doing what is possible.
See, it's interesting though, because I've always my counter argument to that, Zach, is okay, but what if a bank vault was unlocked, right? And then nobody was watching at that second. Could you technically have walked in, stolen the money, and walked out? Absolutely. But just because it's possible doesn't mean it's legal or obviously ethical or moral or anything. But it's an interesting dynamic, though, because in the case of a bank, for example, imagine you just execute a transaction and instead of the bank sending you $10, they send you $10 million. What legal right do you have to that money? Arguably not much, unless that you were a debtor. They had owed you that, and this was some form of repayment that was accidentally sent. There was a case like that. But in this case, I just don't think you have any legal right to that, even though you're using the code as operated, just like in the case of a bank vault, because you use things the way they're meant to be used. Or sorry, just because you can use things in a certain manner that you're able to doesn't justify the actions or the consequences of those actions.
Yeah, totally understand. I want to switch gears a little bit because you have a unique position in what you've done. You've talked to over 100 people on your show, and I can't imagine how many off the mic, right? Because to get to the point where someone comes on your show, sometimes it works out, sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's just people that don't want to get recorded, right? How have you seen I guess, the stance of both your guests and the regulatory landscape change since you started Law of Code 2 years ago?
That's a great question, Zach. It has seemingly become less optimistic in the US, frankly. The conversations I've had over what's possible and what is likely to occur over the next couple years has seemingly shifted away from the US is the place to be, that this is where we're building, to now more of an ethos in you have to leave the US if you want to be able to comply with regulation or build something. And that's unfortunate because I think the US historically has been successful because it was the land of opportunity, because there was freedom to build. There was this capitalism approach where if you identified a problem, presented a solution, you would benefit materially from that solution. Whereas in communism or in other areas of the world, there isn't that opportunity to do so. On not a counterpoint, but on a side note to that, the one thing that I found very consistent with my guests is the optimism for crypto. And that was something I was interested in seeing because I didn't have the podcast back during the last bear run. And I wasn't sure if my listeners would drop off when the price went down. I wasn't sure after Terra Luna crashed, would this still be a tenable area to be in? The resilience of this industry is amazing. And I think because we've all been in the industry for a few years, and not all of us, but most people have been in the industry for a few years, they've seen the ups and they've seen the downs, but they've recognized that technology doesn't change. It's basically like saying the sun will rise whether you see it or not, even if it's cloudy that day or not. There is still this technology at the base layer, and the promise of that technology really keeps me positive in the space. And it's comforting to know that the who's who of the crypto law bar, for example, is sticking around and continues to work to advise clients who are building really innovative projects in this space. But that all is to say, we have seen quite a bit of a chilling effect and a bit of anger as well in the US just on how untenable the regulation and how misleading statements by Chair Gensler have been when it comes to just come in and register. There's a form on our website.
Yeah, look, being based in the US in Atlanta, I totally have all of those feelings. I think listening to his testimony earlier this week when we recorded this was very frustrating because it was quite obvious. One, he has no idea what he's talking about. And two, he won't take it as a hardline opinion. Like you can't even get him to kind of commit to an opinion on whether ETH is a security or what might entail whether it could be ruled a security. But then you see another Wells notice, and you're just like, well, what are we supposed to do here? I guess is this something that you've seen to Canada's benefit? Is there some sort of benefit that countries that may be passing more regulation have been more definitive in their stances on it are seeing because the U.S. is kind of quote unquote dropping the ball here?
Definitely. And it's something I think countries are beginning to capitalize on because they realize the inflow of economic activity that results in it. Canada was one of the first countries in the world to offer a Bitcoin backed investment fund. And the lawyers that I work with, one of the lawyers I work with was part of the team that helped make that a reality. And we see in the US, the ETF, the spot ETF for Grayscale still hasn't been approved. They're still going to court. Meanwhile, in Canada, we've had this for years, and investors can hold it in their registered accounts. They can hold it in tax-free savings account and benefit from the returns there. So we have seen a huge amount of capital inflow for that. We also have regulated staking. So in Canada, you can access through a registered crypto asset trading platform staking services, and you can be confident that these staking services are following all the rule of law. So I do think it opens a huge opportunity. The difficult part is, and what's interesting about the US and most markets in the world, is since the advent of electronic exchanges and alternative trading systems in the late 1990s, all the rules in place now pertain to anyone offering services to individuals in those jurisdictions. So even if you're based in the US but only offer services to Canadians, you'll be regulated by the Canadian securities regulators if you're offering products that are deemed to be securities. So that makes it interesting in that, yes, you can come to Canada and set up and build a service in a compliant manner here, but who can you market to? Can you get access to customers in the US? And we haven't seen that case. It's often this domestic approach to law, which of course is the way it works around the world. But I think crypto has really pushed the law towards a more, even more, unfortunately, more centralized method of governance. We see things like the travel rule, and there's FATF, and there's all the World Education Fund, and all these different entities that can act as a global regulator, which might not necessarily be the best thing for the world. I think there is something to be said about being able to vote with your feet and move to countries where you agree with the laws more than others. But what crypto in Canada specifically really does is we have a path to registration for crypto asset trading platforms. So in March 2021, they issued staff notice 21329, which essentially said crypto asset trading platforms come in and register. And the basis of that was that they held, and this was after Quadriga, which was a big black eye for Canada. So a lot of focus was on the custody of the crypto by these crypto asset trading platforms and the custodians, and a real focus there. And so what we saw was regulators taking the position that the assets themselves might not be securities. That's up to the platforms to decide. But the relationship that the customer has to the asset, meaning the customer themselves doesn't get the asset delivered to their wallet, but what they do is they have an underlying contractual right to the asset that's held on the platform of the crypto asset trading platform. So you don't, like, when you hold Bitcoin on one of these platforms, you're not actually, their argument is that you're not actually holding this commodity. You're holding a derivative or a security, something, and they call it a crypto contract that evidences your right to the asset. And then when you move it off the platform, then all of a sudden now you have that commodity.
How does that vary from like public equity, like stocks?
It's different than stocks because they have two carve outs. So when it comes to something like a crypto contract or a crypto trading platform, there's two rules that pertain to them. Well, there's a lot of rules, but there's two things that regulators said would make these platforms subject to securities laws. First would be that they're trading in a security or derivative, so something that would obviously bring them within the jurisdiction. That's something that's traded like a share that has dividends and things like that. The difference between a crypto contract and a security, though, is that the underlying crypto itself can't be a security. So what regulators say is that you're either trading a security and therefore we have jurisdiction, or you're trading a crypto asset that isn't a security. And we have an enumerated list of securities that include evidence of indebtedness, notes, equities, bonds, etc. If you're holding a crypto asset that doesn't fit within any of those definitions, and that's up to you, crypto trading platform, to determine whether or not it is. If you say that it's not a security and you do choose to list it, but you don't effectuate immediate transfer of the asset, then all of a sudden now what you're doing is not a securities offering, but you're subject to securities law because you're giving access to investors who are purchasing these quote unquote securities therefore you're subject to our jurisdiction. So the big difference is that these crypto contracts aren't evidencing security. Now, whether that can stand up in court is still something, frankly, to be seen, because there hasn't been any litigation on this. And most of the law we've seen has been not official law. It's been through staff notices, which are pronouncements by the staff of the Canadian Securities Administrators saying they're basically giving their opinion on the way securities rules should apply to crypto assets.
That's interesting. I go back to the kind of the model of the SEC when you say that, which is that after actually hearing, I actually learned about this from your show, having Hester Peirce on there earlier, how they operate, where essentially the chair holds all the power. And if they were to issue their opinion, which Hester Peirce has done, it actually doesn't carry any weight.
Yeah.
Which sounds like is different than what you're talking about in Canada.
Yeah, I mean the way the securities regulatory landscape works in Canada is much different than the U.S. In the U.S., you have the SEC that was given all this power post Securities Act of 33 and 34. In Canada, we have 13 different provincial and territorial regulators. So imagine each state in the U.S. has its own securities regulator. Of course, that could lead to many different states having different rules, and it could make it very expensive for participants to enter the capital markets. So in Canada, we have what's called a passport system, where you can have a principal regulator and then passport the exemptive relief or any order you've received from that regulator to the other jurisdictions. What we also have is a group called the Canadian Securities Administrators. And this is a body that has no real force of law, and they don't have any official powers. But what they do have is the ability to issue guidance that the provinces can adopt. Similar, I think, to the way the European Union could work, where you have a proposed, or I think the better example would be the UCC, where they have these model laws that states can choose to adapt. And in Canada, we have this guidance that the provinces will agree on. The CSA is made up of members of the different Canadian Securities Administrators. So they would issue guidance, and then the different securities administrators would be charged with accepting, enforcing, and litigating, and allowing registration upon the grounds listed in that guidance.
Yeah, and just for the audience, can you explain what the UCC is? Because I have a feeling that some of my audience will be like, what is that?
Yeah, it's the Uniform Commercial Code. And my understanding of it is that it acts as a model law that states can choose to adopt. So imagine we were to sit down and really think through certain problems and come up with laws that would help address them. We would put this out in the form of a model law through the UCC, and then a state like New York could decide this is something we want to adopt, whereas something like California could decide, we don't want to adopt rule X, Y, and Z. We'll keep things the way they are. That's my understanding. I'm not an American attorney. I did study American law, but I don't want to do any disservice to my American listeners.
Yeah, no, and just expanding on it, just think, what are the rules for trading goods? I think is probably the easiest way for someone to think about it. There are nuances there that determine whether or not you use the UCC or another set of laws, but none of this is legal advice. Don't worry. There's a very nice disclaimer at the beginning of the episode. But it's a good point. I mean, it's funny. I was at we have the Atlanta Blockchain Center here, where we have the Thursday nights panels every single week. And it was a marketing panel, funny enough, because this is mostly a marketing show. And there was a big regulatory legal discussion. Chair Gensler's testimony was this week when we're recording this. And the question that was posed by me was, what happens if you get a MiCA/GDPR, right? MiCA is the crypto law regulation that just passed in the European Union. GDPR is the privacy law that just passed in the European Union. And then you get the US passing it like they're doing privacy, CCPA, state by state. It's a freaking mess. And every single other state is like, well, I may have clients in California and they don't have the right exemptions. It makes it really confusing. If they start to do that with crypto regulation, which is a little bit different because it's involved in the federal banking system, but if they start to do that here, like, I'm worried. We don't have a passport law that allows, people to adopt other laws or respect the decisions of other jurisdictions in that sense. So I don't know. It makes me nervous that someone's going to start to do it, but it could also maybe force the hand of the federal government to start passing stuff here, or we may just miss this. Right. A lot of people are kind of becoming of that opinion, which is that like, hey, good job. You did a great job regulating the internet early on. You're kind of missing the boat with this. So I don't know.
It'll be interesting to see what happens, because I'd be shocked if the US does miss it. What seems to me the biggest problem is how overly politicized every decision has become. And this two-party system, I don't think, does any favors.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. I mean, you sit here and you watch it, and one of my kind of core values of some things I like try to communicate through the show and to people that I talk to is open and honest discourse is absolutely essential. And right now, the way that people communicate in this country, especially in the U.S., is very much about relating how you think about something to your political affiliation, and demonizing, ostracizing people if they disagree with you, that's troubling to hear, right?
It's really dangerous. It's what happened, before World War I, World War II. It's what's happened throughout history repeatedly. And when you can't have discussions, that leads to big, big problems. And I think the politicization of everything, and COVID didn't help. Now science has become political. It's just a dangerous path to go down when people remove logic and start thinking only with their emotions, and it becomes us versus them. And the big problem with democracy is that the 51% majority can do anything that they want to the 49% minority. And that's not the way a system should work. It should be, you can impose rules that you would be willing to have the other side impose on you. And not to say I'm an anti-democratic person, but I do think, we need to be cognizant of the effects of the system. And just because democracy has been the best form of governance compared to everything else doesn't mean, we've thought of everything else.
Yeah, no, there's an important nuance that you kind of highlighted there in what you were saying. And that is, everything has really good characteristics and really bad characteristics about it. Right. And up until recently, we haven't really experienced at a high level, at like a high impact rather, the negative effects of democracy. Right. And so it's like the first time we're being forced to really think about it critically. Personally, I've found one of the best books to read on this was Lee Kuan Yew's biography from Singapore, which is an authoritarian state. Right.
Was he the one who brought Singapore to its modern? Okay, I've heard amazing things. I mean, what's happened with Singapore is incredible. I will definitely need to read that book.
Yeah. I'm happy, and I'll post it in the show notes too if the audience is interested. But look, I mean, one of the things that I took away from it was there are ways to effectuate a voting system that are better than a one-to-one, right? You can be democratic, but be a modified democracy. One of the things that he would push forward was people that have the most impact on the economy should actually have an outsized impact on voting, right? And the way that he defined that was the people that are core building families. So basically, I want to say it was like 30 to 50 years old, you got 2 votes. Everybody outside of those bands got 1 vote, because it was in proportion to what exactly you are affecting, right? Like the laws are going to affect you from those ages, in his opinion, more so than any other ages, because then you're in retirement age and or you're maybe going through school and kind of growing up and doing the other things. So it's
wow.
It's super practical. You'll enjoy it if you give it a read. I actually I listened to it. That's usually what I do, and I finished it in like 2 days.
Oh, that's amazing. I mean, have you been to Singapore?
Never been to Singapore, but it's on
Man,
the bucket list.
it's probably, besides the heat, which was unbearable, it was my favorite country in the world. I mean, they call it a city in a garden, and it really is beautiful, and the architecture is incredible, but also just how they've made it feel so natural, and it's so clean and safe. It's an unbelievable country, and I was a big fan of it. They have interesting rules, and then the laws are very strictly
No
enforced.
spitting.
No, no spitting gum on the road. I think it's I don't know if it's it's definitely illegal, but I don't know what the fine is. But to give you an idea, my brother and I went to see a movie when we were there, and prior to the movie starting, there was this commercial that looked like it was for a SWAT movie that was coming out, where the SWAT team came in and they like killed the attacker, the bad guys, and then at the end it was Singapore National Police, we're on your side. It was like very intense propaganda that I hadn't seen. Like, you don't see that in Canada when you before you watch a movie, and so
You see
it was
previews of other
interesting to
movies
see.
because it's consumer
Yeah,
culture.
exactly. It's much more capitalistic, although it's very capitalism there. They have a really interesting healthcare system as well. They have a mix of private and public, and it's self-sustaining. And the way they hire the government is unbelievable as well. Like, that is the best job you can get in Singapore, is working with the government. And I don't know too many people or too many countries that can say the same thing.
Yeah, they treat it more like a business, right?
Right.
They get that, like, one of the biggest problems here, I can't speak for Canada, but one of the biggest problems here is that, like, once you work for the federal government, it's like almost impossible to fire you. And
Right.
so you have a lot of dead space, a lot of people that are just doing nothing, but like it's too much of a pain in the ass to try and get rid of you, even if you aren't adding any value. Whereas, in countries like Singapore, where they take a slightly different approach, like, this is a business. Are you coming in? Are you supporting the things? Are you doing the right things? Are you adding value? Are you doing your job well? It's, look, they get to learn from our mistakes, right?
Right. Right.
And
And it all goes back to incentives as well, right? If you're an employee and you have no incentive to work harder than the next guy, or your incentive is to clock out at 3 no matter what else needs to be done, that's what you're going to do.
yeah.
And that's what they do.
Well,
Not all of them. There are great government workers, but
yeah.
it's just a matter of incentives.
100%. This is not to call out everybody there, but like you said, the incentives are not there. So you have to kind of be a self-motivated person to do a really good job in some instances, which, if you've ever been to a Department of Motor Vehicles establishment here in the US, you'll figure that out real quick.
I always hear jokes about that. You got to explain it to me. Are the lines just ridiculous? Like, what is the deal there?
It's I think the best meme is like the sloth behind the thing, like. And for people that are listening, I'm moving really slowly, moving things to the side. There's no incentive to get people through efficiently. So what are they going to do? They're going to take their freaking time and be like, well, I needed to double, triple, quadruple check that thing. And that's why I could only see 3 people today. And so, yeah, it's really slow and inefficient. Now it's gotten better. Now you can actually like go and fill out most of the stuff and renew online. But, kind of bringing this back to Web3, like anything like that has systems of record stands to benefit from blockchain. I know we've done a lot of talk about crypto and securities and all that, but the identity space is hot right now. It's an uphill battle because you're having to convince people to change the way that they keep track of things, but it's actually way more efficient. Are you encountering any stuff in Canada or otherwise through your guests that's interesting in that identity space?
Zach, not as much as I would have liked. I really hope to see more. There was one guest that I had early on, Sina Kian. He's a vice president at Aleo, and they're building a zero knowledge proof based blockchain. To me, zero knowledge proofs are such an incredible innovation. And I was talking to Johnny Lee. He's from Atlanta as well. I don't know if you know Johnny.
No, and you have to introduce me though. I try to meet up with everybody here.
Yeah, happy to. He works in the audit and forensic investigation space, I believe, at Grant Thornton. And we were just talking about privacy and how it really is unbelievable that you can give, or you're forced to give this website with servers located who knows where, all your personal information that they store for some arbitrary reason. And when you apply for a rental property, for example, you have to give your landlord all this information about how much money you make and everything. If there was a system that could act as a green light, red light, yes, this person meets the predefined criteria, but you don't get any of their underlying personal information. That, to me, is the most obvious example of where a system like this can effectuate privacy in much, much better ways than we currently have. And when I was in law school, I actually wrote a paper on why blockchain technology provides the GDPR with the solution that it was intended to create. And for those unfamiliar, the GDPR is the broad and very detailed privacy standards that the European Union upholds. I can't recall exactly what the acronym stands for, but it is an important rule that sort of sets the baseline of privacy law in the US or in the European Union. And blockchains can enable this privacy because now you have a trustless system that can't be manipulated by one party. The really difficult part will be getting the tie-in from those on the other side of the field, the regulators, the people who are currently collecting this information, to trust the system. And I think the one way that that'll work is if they're the ones creating the systems themselves. And so I hope that we'll start to see more tools that enable individuals and companies and businesses interact with blockchain in a much more simplified way, much like working with the internet is much easier now. And thank you, Alan. The GDPR, it's General Data Protection Regulation.
Let's go. Good job.
Shout out to Alan.
Got a big shout out to the producer on that one. It's interesting. When I was practicing, I still practice part-time. I was in-house at a SaaS software company that was called User Testing, and what their product was it was user testing, for lack of a better word. But basically, what you would come to us if you wanted to test your digital experience. We had a panel of people. You could segment them by different demographics, different characteristics like income, what kind of computer they use, what kind of phone they have, that kind of stuff. And you could watch them going through your website or your application experience. Now, it's a little bit broader than that, but as you can imagine with that, there's a lot of privacy concerns, right? There is a lot of information, personally identifiable information or personal data, depending on the regulatory regime, that could be processed. What GDPR is focused on is who's the controller, who's the processor. And the controller has certain obligations and the processor has certain obligations, right? And the conversation that I had over and over and over, because this is not usual for software, is that the purchaser, the customer of our software, was actually the controller of the data because they were asking the questions to the panelist. Right. And GDPR was it's like the gold standard. For all intents and purposes, because they got there first. There's been emulation of it, CCPA, which I referenced earlier. But it's a good point, right? If you had a way to verify that all of let me take a step back. When you're differentiating between what is personal data and what is not personal data, what can link you back to the actual person, right? Things like name, birth date, things like that are very important. But if you only know that it is an African-American female between the ages of 25 and 35 who makes over $100,000 a year, that's not considered PII in the US sense or personal data on its own. It's only when it's paired with other stuff. That's where zero knowledge proofs come in, right? You can have all that data in the background, but no company would really need it to do certain things like user testing if they just know those non-personally identifiable characteristics.
It's a great example, Zach. And I think it's amazing how quickly I think we've just grown up in an age where personal privacy, particularly online, I think it was a slow adoption process. First, you'd give an email address, then you'd give your first and last name, then first and last name and home address, then first, last name, home address, and phone number. Now we're adding social insurance number. what you have to give to be a part of certain platform has continued to grow. But because it was such a small and slow evolution, we've sort of become numb to this idea that, oh, I'm giving this Panamanian company all my personal data because I want to access a better derivatives exchange, right? It's a little incredible to think how, if someone were to ask you on the street, like, what's your address, you'd be so weirded out. You would never give it to them. But online, it's such a thing. It's just something that we do, right?
I did it while I was parking the other day.
Someone asked you.
They asked for my address along with my credit card information, along with my birthday, along with my first and last name, along with my phone number and my email to park.
And that was online.
Yeah. And all they care about is getting paid, right? Like, that's the ultimate point. Like, I want to make sure if you're parking in a spot that you need to get paid, you can get paid. So all I should really have to do is connect it to an account, call it Venmo, Cash App, my bank account, whatever it is, through some third-party provider that shows Zach can afford to pay you and does pay you. And if he extends past a certain point, he can pay you again.
Yeah. Yeah. And that just comes, like, that's where something like crypto will play a huge role, because now you can leave a deposit. You can trust the code that the parking will only charge it until you drive away. Once you drive away, it automatically gives you your refund back. Now both sides are confident that a deposit was made and that the parking fee will be paid. And everything goes back to the ability to trust. And trust is such a core foundation of our society that now that you have a technology that can instill trust among people who don't know and have no other reason to trust each other, what a change, what a paradigm shift, what an amazing technology that will really change the landscape of the world going forward.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, if I had to summarize, like, systems of record, privacy, like these core characteristics that we have done one way for so long and has honestly gotten out of hand, right? For instance, on systems of record, I always give is my sister got divorced, but the person at the clerk's office in her local jurisdiction had accidentally crossed out her signature. So there was no copy of her divorce decree where she actually signed it. So she had to go back and refile and get her ex-husband, which is obviously, sometimes it's amicable, sometimes it's not. Sometimes I just don't want to talk to you anymore. And so, like, all this because of human error. Whereas if her divorce was on the blockchain, it would be check that block of confirm that it was actually entered properly according to whatever the standards are set by that government, and you're good, right? What I'm seeing, and I continue to see, is a lot of, there's a lot more eloquent word for this, but basically dual action, which is that, companies like Proppy and like these companies that are trying to sell houses as NFTs and titles and deeds that are much more efficient systems of record on the blockchain, they're doing both. They're doing it the way that it's been done with the system of record, filing properly, sometimes wet signatures, and then they're doing it on the blockchain too. And when and if there ever is, litigation around this, they can go back and say, hey, look, Mr. Judge, you see how much more efficient it is and how much I can prove this more so than going back. But like, that's a long game, and time is not on our side, as I would say. So,
well, it's true. And I think anything, if you look back throughout history, I'm sure the way things evolved would look very similar to that, where you have an existing incumbent and the new technology is a step up, but it does need to tie into the existing system in some way. I'm sure with the internet and filing records online, the technology has been there for so long. Even something like notarizing documents. Why could we not do that via Skype 10 years ago? Right? It's just, how is that any more safe? And even entering your social insurance number now, like with a private key or something, there's just so many efficiencies that can be done. The problem is governments are huge structures. Like you said earlier, many of them have no incentive to move quickly and foster innovation, because why is that in their best interest? They're getting paid no matter what at the end of the day. And so if you don't have those systems that tie into the existing infrastructure, you can't, like you said, show them, hey, here's exhibit A, here's exhibit B. Exhibit A was 10 times faster, 100 times cheaper. Why don't we try to adopt that in a very small way moving forward?
Just for the audience, is social insurance number the same thing as social security number in the US?
Yes, sorry.
Okay. No, it's all good. It's all good. I just want to make sure I was assuming that, but I want to make sure that anybody that's like kind of on the fence of like, what is a social insurance number?
Right.
Yeah, but for all my Canadian listeners out there, shout out. Well, anyways, we're like nearing the top of the hour. This has been a lot of fun. I think this has been one of the more in-depth discussions around, the legal system and regulatory capture. And for those people that are like, wait, isn't this usually about like marketing and brand? Guess what? This is about overcoming the impediments that are keeping Web3 from getting mass adoption, and safety and regulation is a primary focus. If you guys have listened to the other episodes with Girat's founder or Chainalysis CMO that does forensic blockchain, I mean, those types of businesses and lawyers and podcasts, people like Jacob, like they're the ones that are going to put us in the right place so that the next couple 100 million people can adopt this technology and governments can adopt this technology. So that's why I brought you on, man. This has been hugely informative. I've got 2 traditional closing questions. The first one is, how do you describe Web3?
I describe Web3 as a paradigm shift in ownership and control from centralized third parties that are often in adverse positions to their customers to a method of ownership and control that is customer first, much more like a co-op structure where members are the ones who govern, members are the ones who benefit, members are the ones who participate in how the entity itself moves forward. And a good example I like to give is looking at social platforms, where currently the model is let's keep people on the platform as long as possible to get to sell as much advertising space to advertisers. Future model, Web3 model, how do we benefit ourselves and how do we create something that we all want that isn't predicated on us spending as much time on the app as possible and can lead to a much more equitable outcome for all, as well as reward the people who actually make the product and the service what it is.
Yeah, that's a really, really good point, and quite prescient. If people have listened to recent episodes with Dan Romero over at Farcaster, if you change that incentive alignment and the way that the algorithms prioritize what they want you to do within the app, what happens? And I think like the most natural place for people to start is like, wait, do I get to sell my data? So do I get to see some of that money? And like maybe, right? There's been a few attempts at that, but really more like, is it providing value when you go inside these apps, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not necessarily monetary value, but like, are you going in there and having a deeper discussion about regulation, a deeper discussion about how you can build a family the right way, or anything that is actually adding value as opposed to doom scrolling, as I like to call it, which is kind of where we're at now, because it's all about how long can I keep people in there? The social dilemma, I think it was called, had an interesting illustration of that with the command center and all that. So anyways, the final question that I ask every guest, and this is meant to be fun. I'm not asking you to predict the future, but I kind of am. I ask them, where do you see yourself in this space writ large in the next 6 to 12 months? And where do you see yourself in the space in the next 5 to 10 years?
That's a good question. I think in the next 6 to 12 months, I continue to see myself in the space advising clients on navigating the regulatory landscape in Canada. So not a very fun answer, but I think over the 5 to 10 years, I do think we'll start to see some rules that change the game and enable the system to proliferate. That being said, though, I think we don't need as much regulation as people say. There's all this harp and we can't operate unless we have regulation, blah, blah, blah. Bitcoin is operating perfectly fine. It does not need regulation to enforce who's running the nodes, who's running the miners, who's transacting. What we do need is some comfort for novel business structures to exist. Things like DAOs. That's where I think, and that's where I hope to play an important role in stewarding policy forward. And one really good book that I've read is called The Company, and it's about the history of the joint stock corporation and the limited liability company. Because if you look at what organization has made the biggest impact on human history, you could say the church, you could say the state, the government, But companies have a really strong argument that they have been the most important innovation. And what do companies do at their core is they facilitate economic activity amongst organizations of people in a much more efficient way. And things like DAOs, technology like crypto, now can do that in a way that was never before possible. And so to me, I think there are existing rules that work. There is some room for improvement of the public policy, but ultimately, I think we can build a system given the rules we have now. If they adapt to effectuate better, more effective systems, that will be an enormous advantage to any state that implements those rules, because you're essentially taking the brakes off and allowing much more effective formations of capital. And you're essentially freeing people to build in a way that they never before could, just like the internet provided an ability to communicate in ways that never before would have been possible. Blockchain does that with value. And I think over the next 5 to 10 years, I hope to play an important role, or at least a very, very small role in that. Whether it's interviewing people and getting their perspective on things, or working on a policy side as well. And hoping to continue to have conversations like this, Zach, because I really admire the work you do. I think the Web3 and Me with Me podcast is great. You ask really good questions. You're a great interviewer. So thanks for having me on. It really was a privilege.
Yeah, no, thank you. I feel exactly the same way. When people ask me, like, what are my top Web3 podcasts? Yours is one that I point them to, because again, the focus here, my mission since I quit my regular job to do all this stuff is like, I want to legitimize this industry, and you're doing a lot of work to do that. So thank you, Jacob. Thanks for coming on, man. This was a blast.
Oh, my pleasure, man. Anytime. And thanks for the kind words. I think all credit goes to the guests and to everyone in this industry for being so friendly and welcoming. I've only been in it for about 3 or 4 years now, but I think it is a great industry to be in, and I'm excited for what's next.
Thanks for tuning in to Web3 with me. If you enjoyed the show and want to help us grow, please hit the subscribe button on YouTube or leave us a review on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. If you want to connect with me personally, you can find me on Twitter @Zach_French_.